Welcome to our webinar session today entitled A Whole New World, Virtual Tournaments. You see our outline there on the screen. We'll talk a little bit with an overview. We'll look at the advantages and the disadvantages, these challenges that are presented to us as directors, administrators of tournaments, as well as coaches and students, and what they face in using virtual tournaments, and also share some best practices. So that's the overview of our webinar session today. What brought us to this point? A global crisis, a health crisis brought us to this. You and I know that it's essential in speech, debate, Congress, that our events be face-to-face. There is that audience interaction, that community of speech forensic folks that make us unique in what we do. So is this the ideal situation for us today? No, it is not. But you as coaches, teachers, administrators are meeting the challenge for our students. And you're doing that because you know how vital speech and debate is for students and the skills that it produces in them. So when you have lemons, you just make lemonade, and that's what we're going to try to do as long as we are living in this health crisis. Our philosophy, however, is that we always want to go back as soon as it's safe to that face-to-face competition. So let's look for a moment about the positives. What are some good things that are coming out of these virtual tournaments? I hope that many of you in the audience today actually participated in our at-home experience that we developed for the month of May. Having been one day away from the cross-examination state debate tournament, the 110th year that we were to host it, to get the news that the University of Texas had shut down and there would be no tournament was devastating to me, as I'm sure to many of you and your students. And so what our staff at the state office did was to begin immediately to brainstorm, how can we make things happen? In what way can we make things happen? And so we looked at an at-home experience. Many of you participated in that, and that gave students the opportunity to still fulfill that senior year or that year of forensics and all the hard work. Some of you just finished the National Speech and Debate Association Nationals. Many of you might have been a part of MASC or the Tournament of Champions Nationals that all went virtual. And collegiately, we saw several national tournaments occur. Of the state associations like UIL, only 4 did not cancel everything. Those 4 sought to try to find some way to be able to give our students experiences, and that's where the UIL at-home experience actually came from. So we tried to look at the positives, and there are some good things that happen. For those of you who have very limited budgets, suddenly you're able to do a lot more tournaments if that makes it possible. You don't have the budgetary restrictions. You have reduced cost in all those traditional areas, like you don't have to pay for buses. You don't have to pay for a plane ticket or hotel rooms or food for your students. So in some ways, that really allowed more opportunities. The other positive is that more students can sometimes participate. If you are a UIL school that is Conference 1A, 2A, 3A particularly, you know that your students participate in lots of things. They wear lots of extracurricular activity hats. And suddenly, because they don't have to go to a physical tournament, if they can work it in their schedule, It makes it possible for them to participate on your team when many times they just did not physically have that time where they could go to a tournament with you. So those are some of the positives that we see. And if you look at this next slide, what you're going to think about, I want you to think about is, let's think out of the box. If you are located in the Panhandle, you probably can't come to a lot of tournaments at South Texas and Lavernia High School or Northeast Texas for Athens High School. You have to stay within your region. You already have bus rides that are 3 and 4 hours just to get to a West Texas tournament. But the fact that we're virtual can give greater access, and it can put your students into competitions where you know there are lots of strong forensic programs. So you get a lot of high caliber competition. You're not restricted to that geographical competition. Now, let's say you host a tournament. And if you're like me, thinking about how do we make state meets happen virtually, there's a little bit of fear there. So I had to think to myself, what are some of the advantages? Well, first of all, judges. Wow, I can now recruit judges from all over the state, even out of state. I can bring in former UIL state champions that maybe now live in Florida who can get on their computer and they can judge these performances or judge these debates. So that's pretty exciting. It also reduces, as a tournament host, a lot of the money that I have to put into judges. And you know that's a huge chunk of what we have in expenditures when we're running a tournament is I've got to pay those judges a judge fee, sometimes travel, sometimes hotel. And then you have that hospitality. Coaches don't want to go to a tournament where there's not lots of great food, but you no longer have that because they're sitting in their own living room and they can munch out of their own kitchen. So, hey guys, you know, you got the lemons, you look for the lemonades, you see what you can do there. And those are some of the positives that come out of what if we run this tournament and we run it on those computer screens. As a tournament host, I look at it as a schedule that can be more efficient. It can run faster. If you have qualified students for UIL state speech tournament, you know that it takes quite a while to get ballots back from those panels of judges. And sometimes they come into the tab room and they're wrong. Someone didn't sign their ballot. Someone didn't rank their individual evaluation forms just like their master ballot. And all that slows the process down. M'Liss disagrees with me, so I had to put sometimes in there when I said, I think that you can get those ballots to the tab room faster if you're submitting online ballots. Now, it all depends on if that online system actually catches your mistakes as you submit that ballot. But sometimes, M'Liss, I do think you can process those faster because they come in. One of the, comment. Mm-hmm.
The only difference that I heard the national director saying, that the people who had actually done online tournaments on a national basis say that yes, that was true, except that judges frequently, because they could type their ballots, they were taking a longer time to write their comments, and that was slowing them down. That as the tournament director, they were having to email and even call the judges saying, okay, enough on comments, get your ballots in.
Well,
So
and I
there
think,
have to be guidelines.
Well, and that's certainly a good thought. And maybe the reason I see it from a different perspective is that one of the tournaments that I participated in, I loved the software that was used. And I won't promote it here in our session, but what I will tell you is it allowed me to submit the ballot to the tab room and then gave me a 3-hour window where I could finish that ballot for the student and the coach to read. So I love that. How many times have you turned a ballot in and walked away and later thought, oh, I wish I'd told that competitor this. I wish I'd written that on the ballot. So
True.
perhaps it depends on the software that's used to run the tournament.
That's probably correct.
And I absolutely love that feature. I thought that was really good. But again, I can see where some debate judges might take forever with their ballots. M'Liss, let's talk a little bit about the challenges. And I think the first thing we have to do is address the elephant in the room. We
Yeah,
already exist in speech and debate. We have to be highly concerned about haves versus have-nots anyway. So how much more does this increase, you think?
I do think it puts a little bit of problems in, but I will tell you the two tournaments that I judged, um, obviously you could see a difference. Some students Wi-Fi connections weren't quite as fast as others. In the final round that I observed of pros, for instance, one of the young men's froze completely at his climax. You know, it just froze his scene. But the head judge just came on and said, "Hey, you know, you're frozen. Can you do something with your camera? Can you fix it?" The young man fixed it, and then the judges quickly conferred and said, "We want you to just continue on from where you were," and he did. And that young man 1 second. So he, the judges certainly didn't hold that against him. Um, and my student won first in that round, and he also didn't have the best of, I mean, while he was performing, I was kind of chagrining because I was like, oh, it was a little jumpy at times. But I think they just looked past that and just looked at the overall performance. You adapt as a judge to watching, and you're not going to hold it against the student just because he doesn't have a fabulous background and a fabulous camera and a fabulous mic. I think, but yes, obviously, there are differences about that.
Well, and I think when some of the national tournaments announced that they would go virtual, that was one of the initial reactions from coaches was, well, we just won't participate because we can't do it live.
Mm-hmm.
I think as time went on and people started looking at the issues and how to deal with those, and they began to realize, hey, we're not spending 7 to 10,000 on hotel and travel and food, so maybe we have a way to look at our technology levels and see what can happen. Now, you can't change the fact that some students live in very remote rural areas, and that's certainly true in Texas. I know when the Austin schools and the schools in that area went to e-learning, when COVID forced the shutdown in Texas and schools were closed, there were many, many students who, didn't even have cell phone reception where they lived, much less what you and I might take for granted in terms of working at universities where we have, great laptops and those kinds of things. And school districts really were challenged in how do we get this e-learning done equitably to students. So I think school districts have already begun to have to address that, where they loaded school buses up with hotspots and drove them to these rural areas. They checked out Chromebooks where students who didn't even have laptops at home had to deal with those kinds of issues. So as we go through the rest of this pandemic, I think we're learning day to day. Everything is evolving. Yes, there are haves versus have-nots, but I think that's an issue that forensic people are particularly cognizant of, and I think we work together to try to work that out. I know some people for the national tournament actually were they were allowed into their school building, and they were allowed to spread kids out into separate rooms. Everybody wore masks. They did all this protective uh, methods, but they still were able to do that, where those students who otherwise in that school district wouldn't have the facilities, wouldn't have the resources to compete, actually got to do that. But I do think you're looking at financial realities, and you may can speak to this some, particularly if any of you in the audience were in Melissa's webinar the other day on coaching oral and turf. She had two students perform. One performed live and one performed via video. There are lots of issues that we have to come to grips with for those families. And you see some of the issues there on the screen. I grew up in a family where there were 3 teenagers in high school at the same time. I don't know if we would have had 3 laptops or not. So you need to think about that. And do they have access to high-speed internet? I know many of our staff at UIL, when we went to work remotely on March 13th, had to upgrade our internet. It just wasn't fast enough to do all the Zooms that we were being required to do constantly. So lots of issues there that are challenges. M'Liss, can you talk a little bit about the home environment that now we're dealing with? They don't get to put on a suit and get in your van at TJC and go somewhere and, enter another world. They're actually in their own world. Talk about that.
That's true, and my students definitely had their challenges. One of them was because of the crisis at home, taking care of his younger niece and nephew, and he was like, I have to take care of them because their parents are working, and I'm the only one that's not working right now in my family. And here you want me to do this national tournament, and I was like, okay, you're going to have to find a friend that can come over and help you, or you're going to have to find another relative to come over. And he was serious enough about wanting to compete that he found somebody that on the 2 days of competition took care of those kids. But I will tell you, during one of our final rehearsals, one of my other students was in the middle of a rehearsal, and we were doing it through Zoom. We were doing coaching through Zoom, and the neighbor started mowing their yard next door, and it was right outside his bedroom. Was right next to the neighbor's yard, and I was like, okay. I said, that was pretty noisy, and you got to, do you have a good relationship with your neighbor? Can you go over and ask them not to mow their yard on these 2 days? And he laughed and he said, yeah, I can. He said, I can go over there. So he did. But that's, talk about unusual. That's something you never have to think about when you're at a regular tournament. I had another student who her younger brother and sister were there with her, and she said they're gonna bust into the room, and I taught her how to put a chair in under the door under the door to keep them from coming in to the room, and they never did, bless their hearts, during all of her competitive rounds. But she said they're not trying to be mean, they're just young, and they're just going to come into my room. And I was like, well, you got to figure out a way to keep them out of it. So there are all kinds of distractions, and there are things. When I was judging, I have to tell you this story because it was so priceless. I had a student who checked into the room. They were supposed to check in 10 minutes prior to the round and make sure that they were all there, and we were doing a mic test and a camera check on everybody before the round started. And he showed up, and he had on a t-shirt and shorts, and he had his bed was unmade behind him, and he was obviously in his bedroom. And I was like, oh, are you so and so? And he said, yes ma'am, I am. And I was like, okay, well, obviously your mic and your camera work. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe he's going to be so casual, with this. And then he muted his camera, and when he came back on, 10 minutes later, he was in full suit, and looks great, looked very professional, but his bed was still unmade behind him. And of course, I didn't hold that against him that his bed was unmade by any means, but those are just things that you have to talk to your students about. I talk to my students. We practice with them in their environment that they were going to be competing in, and made sure that there is as least the least amount of distractions in the background as possible.
Right, and we'll address even more of that later in this presentation. I am concerned about the second bullet there under the home environment, which is no access to proper performance spaces. What do you do for a child that becomes, or a young person that becomes intimidated about actually going virtual because of the home they live in that is not as nice as what yours might be?
Um, that's a good question. I will tell you that one of my students that I know is from a poor background first said that he wanted to be filmed at his church instead of at his home. And I said, that's fine. I don't care. And so he was practicing at his church. And when we were doing rehearsals and coaching, he was at his church for a long time. And then he eventually said, no, I think I want to go back and do it in my bedroom if that's okay. And he said, I think the internet might be better at home than it is here at the church. But I knew it was because he was self-conscious, about the background. But he set it up to where he just had a wall behind him. I mean, it was just a colored wall. Now, at the first of it, he had hung his trophies and medals and stuff. And I asked, I said, you're going to have to take all that down because that looks a little like you're bragging that you won all these things. So he took all that down, and it was just a plain wall. And so it was fine. And I think that most students would be able to find a space, but a church is a good possibility for some of our students. I think that they would probably have access and be able to use a room there.
I also think that they're in better shape than we are. The generation we're coaching are those students who have cut their teeth on technology. So that third bullet there that talks about having technical difficulties and having nobody there to help you, we're fortunate because we work on a university campus, and when something glitches, we call our IT people immediately. Well, a student wouldn't be able to do that. They would have to problem solve on their own, although they're probably better at problem solving that than we are.
I will tell you that the tournament that we participated in nationally had a help assistance room that you could go to. And sure enough, one of my students was having trouble with his camera, and they helped him. So they had put 4 people. I went and talked to him a couple of times myself, and they had 4 computer experts that were in that room, and they each would take turns helping you.
So as a tournament host, that's something that you may not have to have hospitality, you may have to have IT people
But you
instead.
might have to have IT. That's right.
That's right, IT, not sweet tea, I guess.
That's a good one. Yeah.
As a state director, when I was working through trying to prepare the at-home, UIL at-home experience, there was no way to run extemporaneous speaking without relaxing traditional contest rules, because as you know, UIL doesn't allow access to the internet in the draw room. There was a lot of integrity on the table there, where you had to depend on people to have a lot of integrity. So the challenges of virtual come, I think, from a administrative tournament host situation is, how do we massage those traditional contest rules when we have online capabilities? I think there's also the real negative to the virtual tournament is you don't have your audience there and you don't have that interaction with the judge. What impact do you think, M'Liss, that had on your students as they performed in that national tournament?
They honestly said that they adapted to that pretty well, but of course part of that was because it was a national tournament. That meant that they had been competing all year long, and had experience in competing. I think all of us will be in a little new world this fall if we begin with virtual tournaments, which I think we will. And I think that's just something that you're going to have to talk your students into, realizing that if they're doing a funny piece and they don't hear anybody laughing, well, you can't be thrown off by that. You just have to
Exactly.
realize that that's the way that it has to be. Uh, I actually was judging one of the at-home tournaments, and one of the judges left their mic on, and we could hear her laughter at the funny parts and whatnot. But unfortunately, we could also hear her chair creaking and her as she was moving around, and we could also hear her munching her chips as
Oh,
she was eating some chips while she was judging. So I think it's better off if all judges are muted, if everybody in the office is muted.
right. Well, and I think all coaches would definitely relate to the challenge of there's less community building among your squad members. There is so much to be said for the journey, even those students who never win a trophy or a medal, the fact that they get on a bus and they become part of a unit that they may have never been a part of any kind of unit before, that becomes like family. And those trips to the hotel and learning things about that, the trips to restaurants and learning how to tip and learning how to act and learning which fork to use and which spoon to use. Those are all things that are, not all about the forensic competition, but they are so critical to the entire experience that a student has. And so I think the virtual very definitely is not the best of the best, and certainly only, we hope, temporary. But I do think that's one of the things we don't experience as much. Now, you may see a different side to that, M'Liss. I don't know, but that's
Oh,
my
no,
concern.
I know, I agree with you, and I just came off of a collegiate national conference where we were talking about some of this, and I know that I have full intention of, on the day that we would normally travel to a tournament, I'm going to require all of the team members, we're going to have a Zoom meeting, and we're going to play games. We're going to do some of the stuff that we would do on the van, on the bus down to the competition. We're going to do them through a Zoom meeting, because I don't want them to miss out on that. I think that is essential,
That's a
and I think
great
that'll help.
idea. A great idea. The issue about copyright with particularly the interp events concern me a great deal as a state director. I chair a national committee that has worked a lot on this, and I am highly concerned. I think as coaches, you need to be concerned to pay attention to the procedures that the tournament you're entering is actually following, because you certainly do not want your school district to get challenged in the court systems because of copyright non-compliance. We've been very fortunate, I think, during COVID, in that nationally we have requested a lot of publishers to give us temporary copyright compliance through the end of June so that we could get through some of these national high school tournaments. But they're not going to do that forever, and we don't know how long this pandemic will last. So I do think there are real challenges and concerns about your copyright compliance when you have recorded performances. We made the decision with the UIL at home experience that all of those interp-rounds would be live. Some tournaments I know are discussing, well, let's do a hybrid. Let's do some live, let's do pre-recorded in prelims, and then let's do live in the out rounds. But again, I think you as a coach need to be very savvy on what is this tournament, what are their procedures, and are they staying within the law? Because you certainly don't want that to come back on you. Great things about being able to compete in that you can compete in another state that maybe you've never been able to do before, depending on what their schedule is. But you also have to think about time differentiation. If you are competing in a California tournament or an East Coast tournament, please realize that they're not Central Standard Time. I have to do that a lot of times. I'm going to in my remote office, a national convention next week. And everything they sent me had Eastern time on it. And I had to think, okay, let me think. I'm in Texas. What does that do to that? So you really have to take that into account. I do think, let's go to that. Let's go to a better slide here. In terms of judges, that you may have some judges that you've used forever at your tournament, and they are excellent judges, but they're in a generation that really doesn't use technology. And those may have to be the people who drop off of your judging list, and there's maybe some hurt feelings there. But I know that initially when some of the virtual tournaments started happening, I had a person that judges all over the state say to me, well, I'm not going to do this. I looked at the requirements of sitting on the laptop, and I just don't think I can do that. Well, they got brave enough and decided they would, and they ended up loving it. But you do have to consider, can my judges have that adeptness that they need with technology? The other thing is, you sit a long time in front of a computer screen, and we'll talk about schedules in more detail in a moment, but someone from the national tournament said, I judged 4 rounds of debate and I sat in front of my computer 11 hours. That's a lot to ask out of a judge. So you're gonna have to think about just how well that works and how you can recruit judges to cooperate with you there. And that leads to the big challenge of technology burnout. Teachers in the audience that we can't see right now, but we're anxious to hear from in the chat room, you all have been spending your time adapting your curriculum to e-learning. And you know the requirements that your students had this spring in order to graduate, in order to get through the semester. They were already investing a lot of screen time. Add to that the tournament itself. And there's a lot of fatigue that we have to be aware of. M'Liss, I know you're dealing with this, these kinds of schedules that you see under bullet 3 with our state speech convention. So you want to talk a little bit about synchronous and asynchronous?
Yes, of course, that's one of the biggest considerations is are you going to do a synchronous tournament? Are you going where they're all competing live, everything's live? Are you going to do the asynchronous where they are doing some recording? I am heavily in favor of the synchronous for tournaments, just because I think it is more like the real thing. I gave a lot of thought to this ever since Jana asked me to join in this meeting, and I said the only exception to that, I would think, is if there was a student that lived so far out that didn't have any internet connection whatsoever, and the only way that they were able to compete at all is if they could drive into town and do a videotape. But then, of course, I want to say, well, why can't they drive into town and do the live at the same thing? But I can see that there may be an argument for why that there would be an exception. Uh, but I know for our state speech convention, we're strongly considering doing a combination of both synchronous and asynchronous presentations. But that's for a teaching, that's a different, we're teaching individuals, and we're trying to reach out to potential speakers that maybe doing a filmed recording of their speech would be more cohesive to their schedule. I think if you're going to do a tournament, you need to do it live. I mean, overall, that's my bottom line on that.
Well, and that leads to talking about video and recorded performances or speeches. One of the arguments against that is that you don't grow and you don't learn from each performance that you do when it's live, and you get that ballot back and you get that feedback from your judge, and that it advantages kids that have extensive coaching that can get that perfect video. And so therefore, there's growth in that process, but once the tournament starts, there's not the growth that we like to see from a student if it's not done that way. I wanted you to address about how to deal with those recorded performances, because in your presentation earlier this week, you had a live performance by a student, but then you had a video because that particular student was dealing with babysitting issues, had someone to babysit. Recorded performances restrict that full body view. So how did you coach those kids?
Well, actually, we coached our students to do different body views depending on their event. I will tell you, and that's what I saw that other coaches had done too when I was judging various events. There were some that did almost a full body view. I don't know that I saw the feet of any competitors. It was usually from at least ankle up. I don't think anybody had that much room to do a full body, because you do want to be able to see their facial expressions, and in a video or in a Zoom or whatever, whether you're in 8x8 or whatever platform you're using, it might be a little more distorted if you're further away from the camera. But I think I know that my video student that some of you saw on Monday, he just really did his recording from the shoulders up in that prose, and that was a decision that we had made, that was the best thing for him to do with that piece. Whereas my student who did it live, you saw him from the waist up, so a little bit more.
So do you think it depends on the contest itself?
I think it depends on the event, and I think it depends on your piece. I know that one of my students we have an event in college called dramatic interpretation, and he used the camera as his main focal point, like he was talking to that camera, and he would come in very, very close at times because he was working on their makeup, and it was like he was actually putting makeup on you. I mean, when you were watching, you were like, oh, he's touching my face, he's really just right here. But that we made that decision, to try that, and I think it worked for him. But
So the camera
those are guidelines.
The camera could be restrictive, but it also could enhance the performance.
Correct. And so I think I think that's just something that you have to work on. But I do know that the collegiate 4 national organizations are working on guidelines for all this. And as soon as I get them, I will share with Jana, and I'm sure she might come out with something that she can put online for UIL. But these guidelines are being worked on by professionals in the field.
Well, and there's something else that we're working on, because I want to throw this out to the coaches. Here's a concern I have. Schools are going to be under tremendous financial restrictions this coming year. You know that, because there are, our economy is suffering. Our tax revenue's not going to be what we're accustomed to. The funding that schools receive can't possibly be the same. And so therefore, it's good in lots of ways that we are probably going to do these virtual tournaments, especially for the fall, in that there can be a lot of revenue saving. Now, here's something to be ahead of the curve on, and that is, what happens if your administration says, oh, well, I see that you made this happen. Kids can still compete and just sit in front of a computer. So therefore, you don't need a travel budget, and you don't need all this money in your budget. So, and understandably, they're going to have to cut. I know the University of Texas has given us a huge budget cut. So that's going to happen across the state, because oil is not bringing in what we're used to, and that's 10% of the Texas economy. So how do you deal with this? I think you as a coach have to be ahead of the curve, and you have to know that you're truly going to have to advocate for speech, debate, and performing arts. You're going to have to come up with the rationale, once we get out of this pandemic, of why the face-to-face tournament situation and experience is so very critical, and why you need that budget back if indeed it does disappear. We have been preparing you an advocacy document, and if you're interested in that, we're certainly going to put that link on the UIL website, but you're welcome to email me for that so that you can take a look at it. You, as many of you debate coaches, certainly have done lots of research, I know, on what is the advantage and what are the skills that kids come out with and why it is so important. But what you need to think about is, how do you justify that face-to-face tournament once we've been able to make it happen? This needs to be looked at, in my opinion, as a temporary situation to make the best out of a terrible situation during the pandemic. So just think about that as one of your challenges. Now let's move to best practices. And I think Melissa's great for this. We've already talked a little bit about that scheduling. I know many of you, particularly in the Panhandle, do a lot of swing tournaments. And there's been questions in social media of, how do we do swing tournaments if indeed an organization that we do tournaments with is going to limit to 4 hours of screen time? Because you see that last bullet there talks about that screen time fatigue. And one of the recommendations is you should limit that, and 4 hours might be the good limit. So you're obviously going to have to adapt to rounds that are spread further apart. What about the swing tournaments? I know, M'Liss, you on the collegiate level do a lot of swing tournaments. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I'm a little nervous about it because, as I think I mentioned this earlier, 2 different directors of national virtual tournaments told me, or told all of us at a conference that I just attended, that they had to schedule a longer amount of time for rounds. So instead of an hour and 15 minutes, they scheduled an hour and 30 minutes. Sometimes even an hour and 45, because they needed time to get everything set up and whatnot. And I think it may limit us on swing tournaments on the college level. But because I don't think I'll be too sad about that, because we would be able to do more tournaments. I mean, we don't travel. College usually doesn't travel every weekend like a lot of the high school teams that I know do. We usually only travel 2 or 3 weekends a month, and so if we might could do more tournaments if instead of doing swing tournaments.
Right.
Is what I'm saying. But that's just going to be something we have to kind of work through as we go.
Right. And we did discuss this a little bit in terms of looking at the tournaments you choose, live performances and speeches versus the pre-recorded. We've already kind of discussed the pros and cons of that, and the certainly copyright compliance procedures you need to be careful of. I think you probably may see a lot of hybrids, and the hybrids where you submit your performance recorded, and then if you advance to the out rounds, then it becomes live. And I won't be surprised if that's the option that a lot of tournaments take in that respect. You're also going to have to deal with spectators when, you know, the UIL rules say that every speaking event is public and we invite parents and administrators and teachers and coaches. That may not be the case. When we designed the UIL at home experience, we told those tournament administrators only allow the coach in. No parents, no extraneous spectators, lots of privacy issues that tournament hosts are going to have to be very savvy on in terms of what are your legal rights and responsibilities. One of the problems with allowing those spectators in is them coming in and unmuting their video and their microphone. And then you've got issues just like a regular tournament where somebody comes to the door and barges in. Well, you're going to have that same sort of issue if you allow those spectators in. M'Liss, in terms of your national collegiate tournament, did they allow spectators in those rooms?
They did allow spectators in the out rounds, in the final rounds. They did not allow them in the prelims. And I think it was because they wanted the prelims. Everybody was a little leery, didn't know, really how it was going to go. And so they wanted to make sure, but then they relaxed and let people in. And I will tell you that that was one of my students' problems is he filmed at home and his parents were watching him in the next door, and you could hear them laughing in the background. Now it was very faint, but it was there, and I was like, oh man. I would have said, just like I think Jana mentioned it earlier, no one else should be using the Wi-Fi while the student is competing.
Oh.
You don't want multiple users.
Yeah, let's kind of address some of those, what devices that we recommend and what things you need to be aware of. There's lots more out there, and we give you some sources later, but certainly we realize that not all kids have laptops. Some only have iPads, some only have cell phones. Those really are not as conducive as a laptop because they have that built-in microphone and that webcam. I know lots of my colleagues, now that we've been Zooming every day, have gotten external microphones. I've not done that yet. Some people have bought ring lights so they look beautiful, but I've not gone that far yet. Now, if I were in a virtual tournament situation, I probably would do that. Best practices for connectivity. These become important, and I realize this. I never thought I had inadequate internet until I set up my remote office here. And when I did originally, I have a 2-story home, and I set it up downstairs thinking that was a smart thing to do. That's where my kitchen is. That's where my bedroom is. That's where my living room is. So, and I had this very beautiful pastoral. You could see my backyard with my green leaves and the trees. And I thought, this is good, a stained glass window. Yeah, what I discovered was people were freezing on the Zooms, and I couldn't figure out why. So I cart everything upstairs where my router is. I have a Mac, so I have to buy a special cable to try to plug it in, directly to it, thinking all these things would enhance that and stop that Zoom problem. That just really didn't work for me. And AT&T now has upgraded my internet. So there are things you have to consider and that your student will have to consider. It does seem that through the virtual tournaments that have already occurred, that Chrome seems to prove to be the best web browser. And yes, M'Liss talked about don't be washing clothes, don't be using microwaves. When a kid's at home, he may be in his bedroom competing, but who knows what his mom or dad might be doing in the kitchen, cooking or whatever. And you don't really think about those things. Do you guys? I certainly didn't, but you need to be careful that when you're actually in that competitive experience, that you try to avoid the use of all of those appliances or that your brother or sister's not running Netflix in the other room. That makes a huge difference. So, I thought it was interesting and we keep referring to Monday. I hope a lot of you in the audience were at that Monday interp session. You saw where one of M'Liss's students who did the videoed in what looked like to be a dining room. I don't know, a formal dining room. It was very, very pretty. There were beautiful paintings on the wall. And, I didn't think it was distractive at all, but it certainly he was framed. The young man's body was framed with a China Hutch picture. The young man who performed live performed great. Christy, can you turn off your mic, please? Christy White. And so there was a neutral background. One of the things that I've noticed as I have judged is that kids have their ceiling fan on. Yes, it's summer and a lot of kids are from Texas or the South where it's very, very hot, and they automatically have that ceiling fan running. That is very distractive when you are a judge. So those are things you want to make your students aware of that they might not ever think about. You want a lot of natural light. And so if you're using the window light from your room, you need to tell that student to face the window so that the light is coming in on their face and their body. They may tend to think they should stand in front of the window, but that's not good because you get the backlight there. All right. They need to test their camera to see what's the frame. Are you cutting off part of your head or part of your body that you really want the judge to be able to see? All those details are things that you never have to think about in a face-to-face classroom competition, but you suddenly are having to take these things in. Before the tournament, you as a coach need to make sure your student understands exactly what that tournament procedure is. They should practice multiple times so that they are really in tune with their devices. And then the day of that tournament, they need to be not 10 minutes. I was a little concerned when M'Liss told us the story about the kid who checked in 10 minutes early and he was in a t-shirt and his bed wasn't made and all that. None of that should happen. That should all be taken care of and thought out way in advance. And then test that technology. We saw that happen today as M'Liss was trying to join Jenny and I, and technology was not working at all in her office. And she had to switch to a colleague's office, get into a computer she wasn't familiar with. The PowerPoint was for her to run, and that obviously didn't happen. That's why you're watching me mess up on it so much. And you also have to tell your family members, okay, guys, my tournament's about to begin. Please get off the internet and please don't make noise. It's tough. It's going to be tougher on kids, but it's the best we can do and still have that good tournament situation.
And they'll all adapt. They will adapt.
They will. They will. You want to make sure that you pay attention to the tournament procedures. I think, and it sort of depends on what those tournament restrictions are, but you know, if it's within the tournament restrictions that you can be available via text at least, you know, if that student has that last minute panic, if I had not had a text from M'Liss right before this webinar, I would have been a little panicked, and you want that student to have that reassurance. And I really think that we all just have to accept that technical difficulties can and they will occur. It's going to happen. And I hope that judges certainly have a very broad view of that so that you understand if a dog starts barking in the background or whatever happens, that you maintain that sense of understanding that that student is really having to deal with a lot of variety there. Would you agree, M'Liss?
Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, the shock of the student in his t-shirt, but I got over that very quickly because I realized, you know, it was a new environment for them too. And they were, you know, and by the second round that I judged, I wasn't paying any attention at all to their background or their rooms. I was just focusing in on them. So I think that most of us will be able to do that, and the students will adapt very quickly.
Right. We could give you lots and lots of more best practices, and we will have more of those as M'Liss talks about the document that's being worked on, the guidelines. Also, the more each of us participate in virtual tournaments, the more we pick up. I do think that if you're looking at these virtual tournaments as a pretty sure shot, and I think that's exactly what we are facing this fall, there are some great resources out there online. The Southern California State Junior Forensic League has a wonderful document when they ran their state tournament. As you know, California spiked quicker than almost anybody but New York, and they had to cancel everything. But they came back and reevaluated and said, you know what, let's try to make this happen. And they did an excellent job. And they have wonderful guidelines and details, I thought, online that you will certainly want to look at. Michigan and their state association also did a virtual. Many of you may be familiar with Megan West, a former UIL state champion who now directs all the debate programs there in Broward County. I hope that we can talk her in, and I think we can. She and I have been discussing the possibility of her coming in and doing a virtual webinar about virtual tournaments later this summer, but certainly has done a wonderful job of pulling off 3 major, huge tournaments for Broward County. So there's a lot of good information coming out of that, and she's going to share with me a document she's developing, should have finished by next week, that we will be able to share with UIL schools on best practices. Some of you just finished competing for the National Speech and Debate Association. Lots of great things came out of that, and lots of good information online from them as well. So those are other resources that we just urge you this summer to access and learn all you can, because it's going to happen. It's just the way it is with this pandemic. And you know, from living in Texas, and we're not even out of phase 1 and we're spiking again. So I think you can pretty much bet on that. This is certainly an evolving discussion. We learn something new every day, and every time we sit down at the computer and we try to learn new platforms, new software, trying to discover which ones are going to facilitate these tournaments the best, this discussion continues to evolve. So if you do have questions after we finish and you've not put those on chat, feel free to contact either M'Liss or I, and we will be happy to, we're going to tell you, explore with you, because we are still very definitely learning. I'm going to see now if I can get to the, going to see if I can get to